The phone rang at 6:15 on a Tuesday morning. In a quiet house, a ringing phone before sunrise never brings good news. I was standing in the kitchen waiting for the coffee to brew, watching the early morning fog roll across the lawn. When I picked up the receiver, I didn't even get the chance to say hello. It was my son, Derek. He sounded frantic, breathless, and completely terrified. He told me not to turn on my computer, not to log into my bank, and not to answer any strange emails. He said there had been a catastrophic data breach, according to Derek. The brokerage firm that handled his company's investments had been compromised by a massive cyber attack over the weekend, and because our family accounts were linked through his financial advisory software, my information, my wife's information, and all of our routing numbers were out there on the dark web. Derek told me to grab my tablet and check our primary checking account immediately, but to do it over cellular data, not the Wi-Fi. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the banking app. I scrolled past the pending utility bills and stopped cold. There were 3 strange unauthorized withdrawals labeled as automated clearinghouse transfers. They totaled $4,850. The money was just gone. Derek's voice cracked through the phone speaker. He told me he had just checked his own accounts and was missing over $12,000. He said the hackers were running automated scripts, draining linked accounts in small batches to avoid triggering fraud alerts. He promised he was going to fix it, that he had a contact in cybersecurity who was locking down a safe digital vault for us. All I felt in that moment was the icy dread of a lifetime of security evaporating into the digital ether. Let me ask you something before I go any further. Have you ever received a phone call so terrifying that it completely paralyzes your common sense? Tell me where you're watching from and if you've ever had that cold rush of panic when you realize everything you've worked for might be gone. For the first few hours, I was completely numb. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 68 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. For 42 years, I have been married to my wife, Claire, who spent her career teaching middle school mathematics. We are not wealthy people, not by the flashy standards of modern social media. But we were careful. We lived below our means, paid off our mortgage, and steadily built a comfortable retirement. I spent my entire career as a logistics and supply chain auditor for a major international freight carrier. My job was not glamorous. I was the man they called when a shipping container went missing somewhere between Rotterdam and Seattle, or when a massive corporation's supply chain invoices did not match their digital manifests. I spent 4 decades finding needles in global haystacks. I understand systems. I understand how complex networks operate. And most importantly, I understand that nothing in this world simply vanishes without leaving a wake. Everything Claire and I had built was tied up in a few carefully managed investment accounts and a modest 2-bedroom cabin on the shores of Lake Erie in Port Clinton. That cabin was our sanctuary. It was the place where we spent our summers, where we taught our grandchildren how to fish, and where we planned to spend the twilight of our lives. It was the anchor of our family legacy. We had poured our blood, sweat, and savings into securing a dignified, independent retirement so that we would never be a burden to anyone. Now, sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a screen that told me invisible thieves were siphoning away our livelihood, I felt a profound sense of violation. But I also felt something else. Underneath the panic, the meticulous, observant part of my brain, the part that spent 40 years tracking lost cargo, began to wake up. To understand how we arrived at this nightmare, you have to understand my son. Derek is 38 years old. He has always been a bright, charismatic, and intensely ambitious young man, perhaps too ambitious. While Claire and I valued stability, Derek was always chasing the next big leap. A few years ago, he left a very stable job at a regional bank to start his own boutique financial technology consultancy. He called it Vanguard Solutions. He wore expensive suits, leased a new Porsche SUV every 2 years, and joined a country club that cost more annually than my first car. He always told us he was just months away from closing a massive corporate contract that would set him up for life. We were proud of him, but we also worried about his burn rate. Over the last 6 months, there had been subtle shifts in Derek's behavior, little warning signs that in hindsight were glaring red flags. He became overly interested in the exact structure of our liquid assets. During a Sunday dinner in the spring, he casually asked if Claire and I had placed the lake cabin into a revocable trust, warning us about the dangers of probate court. At the time, it sounded like a son looking out for his aging parents, but his tone was just a little too urgent. Then there were the micro-observations. I noticed he had stopped wearing his expensive watch. During another visit, his phone kept buzzing relentlessly, and instead of ignoring it or taking the call in the room, he stepped out onto the back porch, pacing aggressively and arguing in hushed, desperate tones. When Claire gently asked him later if his business partner was causing trouble, Derek snapped at her. He didn't just answer quickly. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted away, and he offered a defensive, rehearsed excuse about cash flow timing. Then came the sudden shift in his approach to our technology. A month ago, Derek insisted on installing a new security software suite on our home computers, claiming older adults were prime targets for overseas syndicates. He set up the administrative passwords himself. He had access to everything, so when the data breach supposedly happened, and Derek claimed his own accounts were hit, the story was perfectly tailored to fit the fears he had spent a month planting in our minds. But once the initial shock wore off, the logistics auditor in me took over. I opened my laptop. I ignored Derek's warning to stay offline because I knew that if a hacker already had backdoor access, staying offline wouldn't stop an automated bank transfer. I logged into my account portal and pulled the detailed transaction history for the missing $4,850. The ACH transfers were listed under a merchant identifier called Aegis Data Gateway. It looked like a generic payment processor or a cryptocurrency exchange node. Most people would see that and assume it was a sophisticated overseas operation, but I didn't look at the name. I looked at the routing timestamps and the transaction clearing codes. I picked up the phone and called my bank's regional fraud department. I didn't ask for a low-level customer service representative. I used the specific regulatory terminology I knew from my days auditing corporate freight accounts to bypass the frontline staff and get a Tier 2 fraud technician on the line. I didn't ask for a refund. I asked for the origination IP address and the digital routing path of the ACH request. The technician was hesitant, but after I verified my identity and pushed hard, he ran the trace. The data he gave me made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The transfer request didn't bounce through a proxy server in Russia or a dark web node in Eastern Europe. The IP address originated from a commercial server cluster in Cincinnati, Ohio. But that wasn't the detail that stopped my heart. The technician informed me that 3 days prior to the theft, 2 micro-deposits of 12 cents and 14 cents had been deposited into my account, and then instantly verified to link an external funding source. You don't use micro-deposits if you are a hacker stealing data from the dark web. You only use micro-deposits if you are manually setting up a linked corporate account, and you need the account owner's login credentials to verify the exact penny amounts. Someone didn't hack my account. Someone had logged in using my password and manually authorized a permanent link. If you were sitting in that chair staring at your own son's digital fingerprint on a stolen transfer, what would you have done? Would you have called him right then? Every instinct in my body screamed at me to pick up the phone, call Derek, and demand an explanation. But I didn't. In my profession, confronting a suspect before you have the entire manifest is a fatal error. Confrontation without absolute proof only gives a desperate person the opportunity to destroy evidence, invent a new lie, or cover their tracks permanently. I had a piece of the puzzle, but I didn't have the whole picture. I needed to know exactly where my money was going before I let the thief know I was awake. I told Claire I was going to the grocery store, but instead I drove across town to a different branch of our bank to meet with Martin, a senior branch manager I had known for 15 years. I sat in his glass-walled office and laid out the printouts of my account activity. I asked Martin to run a deep interbank trace on Aegis Data Gateway. Because the transaction had already cleared the automated clearinghouse network, the receiving institution's public routing data was available to him. Martin typed quietly for several minutes. When he finally turned his monitor toward me, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Aegis Data Gateway was a doing business as name for a limited liability company called Aegis Holdings, registered in the state of Delaware. The LLC had been formed exactly 3 months ago. The registered agent was a generic corporate proxy service, a standard tactic to hide ownership. But the proxy service required a secondary contact number on the state filing for tax purposes. Martin highlighted the 10-digit phone number on the screen. The area code was local. I pulled out my cell phone, opened my contacts, and matched the number. It was the secondary business line for Vanguard Solutions, Derek's company. There was no data breach, there was no overseas syndicate. The safe harbor Derek was so frantically telling me about was a bucket he had built to catch the water he was draining from our ship. I thanked Martin, walked out to my car and sat behind the steering wheel for a long time. The Ohio sky was a brilliant clear blue, but I felt like I was suffocating. This was not a financial crisis anymore. It was an emotional execution. The man stealing from me wasn't a faceless criminal. It was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in the driveway. It was the young man whose college tuition I had worked overtime for 10 years to pay. He hadn't just stolen a few $1,000s. He had orchestrated a meticulous campaign of psychological terror against his own parents. He had deliberately exploited his mother's fear of technology and identity theft. He had played the protective hero, warning us of the wolves at the door, completely obscuring the fact that he was the wolf. The drive home was the longest commute of my life. When I walked through the front door, Claire was sitting in the living room, anxiously clutching a notebook where she had written down all of our account passwords, terrified that she had done something wrong to cause the breach. I sat down next to her, took her hands in mine, and told her the truth. I walked her through the IP addresses, the micro deposits, the Delaware LLC, and the phone number. I watched 42 years of a mother's love collide with undeniable mathematical proof of betrayal. Claire didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just closed her eyes, leaned her head against my shoulder, and wept silently. The pain in that room was physical, a heavy crushing weight that pressed the breath out of us. We realized then why he had asked about the Lake Cabin Trust. He was mapping our assets. He had been planning this for months. His consulting business wasn't thriving, it was drowning. And rather than admit failure, he had decided to use his parents' life savings as a life raft. He planned to drain us completely, leaving us destitute in our final years, just to maintain the illusion of his own success. As Claire's tears slowed, they were replaced by a quiet, profound resolve. We agreed on one thing. Immediately, Derek could not know what we knew. We could not let him see our heartbreak. We had to let him keep believing he was the smartest person in the room. We had to let him think he had won. The next morning, Derek called again. He was stepping up the pressure. He told me the hackers had breached the secondary firewall at the brokerage firm. He said, our primary retirement investment fund, a mutual fund holding $450,000, representing 40 years of my labor, was completely exposed. He urged me to authorize a wire transfer, moving the entire balance into the federal safe harbor escrow account he had set up. He said he would bring the authorization forms to our house that afternoon. I kept my voice shaky. I sounded tired, confused, and utterly defeated. I told him we were terrified that we didn't understand the technology and that we were entirely in his hands. Whatever you think is best, son, I said. You're the expert. We trust you. The moment I hung up the phone, the real work began. I contacted my primary investment broker and my attorney. I explained the situation with cold, precise clarity. Within 2 hours, we established a legally binding, dual-signature hold on our entire investment portfolio. No funds could be moved out of that institution without both Claire and me sitting physically in the broker's office, presenting our state identification, and signing in the presence of a notary public. We then opened a secondary dummy checking account at a completely different local bank. We seeded it with exactly $1,000. But I needed more than just a financial shield. I needed Derek to trap himself so thoroughly that he could never spin a lie to escape it. I had my attorney draft a very specific single-page document. It was titled an indemnity and fiduciary guarantee. The document explicitly stated that the person facilitating the transfer of funds was acting as a sworn fiduciary, that the receiving account was a secure federal holding trust, and that the facilitator held zero financial interest in the destination entity. It was laced with dense legal jargon, but the core meaning was simple. Signing it while lying constituted federal wire fraud in writing. I want you to imagine sitting across from your own child, smiling, while watching them happily walk into a trap they built for you. When Derek arrived at our house that afternoon, He brought a briefcase and a rehearsed look of deep concern. He sat at our dining room table, laying out the wire transfer authorization forms. He was smooth. He patted his mother's hand, telling her everything was going to be fine. He pointed to the lines where I needed to sign to move the $450,000 to the Aegis Holdings account. I put on my reading glasses, letting my hands tremble just slightly. I signed his transfer forms, but as he reached to pull them back, I placed my hand firmly over the papers. I pulled the legal indemnity document from a folder beside me and slid it across the table. "Derek," I said, my voice sounding suitably fragile. The manager at the bank said that because of my age and the size of the transfer, they require the technical facilitator to sign a standard liability waiver, just verifying that the safe harbor account is federally insured. Derek barely glanced at the paper. His eyes were locked on the signed transfer forms under my hand. His arrogance was blinding him. He didn't read the clauses. He didn't see the legal trap. He simply pulled a silver pen from his jacket pocket, signed his name with a flourish, and dated it. He had just legally sworn, under penalty of perjury, that he was an independent fiduciary, securing our funds completely unaware that he was directing our life savings into his own private shell company. He packed his briefcase, kissed his mother on the cheek, and told us we could sleep easy now. He promised the funds would be safely locked away by Monday morning. What Derek didn't know was that the transfer forms I signed had a slightly altered routing sequence. I had intentionally transposed 2 digits in the transit number. The wire was physically impossible to execute. It would bounce around the automated clearinghouse network over the weekend, and then automatically reject back to our frozen account. Sunday evening arrived. We invited Derek over for a family dinner to celebrate our supposed financial safety. He walked into the house looking like a man who had just conquered the world. He brought a bottle of expensive wine. He talked excitedly about Vanguard's solutions, hinting that a massive cash injection was about to take his business to the next level. Claire served a roast beef dinner. We sat around the table, the clinking of silverware echoing in the dining room. I waited until he had finished his first glass of wine. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, took a slow sip of water, and reached down to the floor beside my chair. I picked up a thick manila folder and placed it squarely in the center of the table, right next to the gravy boat. The conversation stopped. Derek looked at the folder, then at me, a confused smile on his face. "What's that, Dad?" I looked at him, feeling a strange, hollow calmness settle over me. "You know, Derek, in my 40 years of auditing global freight lines, I learned one absolute truth. Things do not simply vanish. Money, cargo, data, they all leave a wake. You just have to know how to read the water." The smile faltered on his lips. "I don't follow." I opened the folder. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same measured professional tone I used when I dismantled fraudulent shipping manifests in corporate boardrooms. "This is the origination trace for the $4,850 stolen from my account on Tuesday," I said, sliding the first piece of paper toward him. "You'll notice the IP address resolves to a server in Cincinnati, not Eastern Europe." Derek's hand stopped moving. He stared at the paper. "This," I continued, sliding a second document across the table, "is the corporate registry filing for Aegis Holdings in Delaware, the entity that received the funds, and this is the secondary contact phone number listed on that filing. The number belongs to the Vanguard Solutions office." The color drained from Derek's face entirely. He looked like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at Claire, expecting her to be confused, but Claire was sitting perfectly straight, her eyes locked on him, her expression a mask of cold, unbreakable disappointment. "And finally," I said, sliding the last document forward, "this is the fiduciary guarantee you signed yesterday. The one where you swore under federal penalty that you held no interest in the destination account. The one you used to attempt a fraudulent wire transfer of $450,000 across state lines. A transfer that, by the way, was rejected on Friday afternoon because the account you tried to drain never contained the money." Silence descended on the dining room. It was absolute and suffocating. Derek stared at the documents. The cocky, untouchable aura he had worn for years evaporated in a matter of seconds. His hands began to shake. He pushed his chair back, his breathing turning shallow and erratic. "Dad, Mom, you don't understand. he stammered, his voice cracking. I can explain. The business is in trouble. I took out loans, bad loans. I'm $600,000 in debt. They were going to take the house. Sarah was going to leave me. I just needed a bridge loan. I was going to invest it, stabilize the company, and put it all back, I swear to God. I was going to put it back before you ever knew. You didn't ask for a loan, Derek, Claire said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a razor. You terrorized us. You made me believe my identity was stolen. You sat at my table, kissed my cheek, and tried to steal the home we planned to leave to your children. Derek put his head in his hands and began to sob. It wasn't the crying of a man who was sorry for what he had done. It was the crying of a man who realized he had been caught outsmarted and completely destroyed by his own arrogance. He begged us to tear up the folder. He begged us not to ruin his life. I reached across the table, gathered the documents back into the manila folder, and closed it. I'm not ruining your life, Derek, I said quietly. You did that yourself, and I'm not going to fix it for you. The $4,000 you stole on Tuesday, keep it. Consider it your inheritance because it is the last dime you will ever receive from us. But the documents in this folder have already been copied. One set is with our attorney. The other set was delivered to the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division yesterday morning. Derek looked up, his eyes wide with absolute horror. He knew what that meant. He had used internet banking portals to fraudulently attempt to move hundreds of thousands of dollars across state lines. It was a textbook felony. We asked him to leave our house. He walked out the front door, a broken man, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, severing the bond of trust that had existed for 38 years. The consequences unfolded over the next several months with brutal efficiency. The financial crimes investigators did not need long to verify the paper trail I had provided. Derek was formally indicted for wire fraud and attempted grand larceny. When the news became public, Vanguard Solutions collapsed entirely. His creditors circled like vultures and the business was liquidated. His wife Sarah, who had genuinely known nothing about his scheme, was devastated. She filed for divorce, took the children, and moved back to Michigan to live with her parents. We ensured Sarah had enough money for a good lawyer to protect herself and our grandchildren from the financial fallout of Derek's crimes. Derek eventually accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy federal trial. He was sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security correctional facility, followed by 5 years of heavily monitored probation. He lost his business, his marriage, his reputation, and his freedom. Not because I sought vengeance, but because the truth of his actions simply demanded a consequence. It has been a year since that terrible Tuesday morning. Claire and I are sitting on the wooden deck of the lake cabin in Port Clinton. The autumn air is crisp, and the leaves on the oak trees are turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The water is calm, reflecting the fading light of the afternoon sun. Our financial security remains entirely intact. The retirement we spent 4 decades building is safe, shielded by impenetrable trusts and the hard-earned wisdom of experience. But survival comes with a profound emotional cost. We grieve for the son we lost. We mourn the boy he was, and we struggle to reconcile that memory with the man who tried to dismantle our lives. Some days Claire looks out at the water, and I know she is wondering where we went wrong. But I remind her, and myself, of a hard truth. You can raise a child with love, you can give them every advantage, and you can teach them the difference between right and wrong, but you cannot save them from their own greed. Aging requires a quiet kind of courage. As we grow older, we naturally want to rely on the people we love. We want to believe that the hands we held when they were small will be the same hands that support us when we are frail. But trust must never become a blindfold. Dignity later in life means protecting what you have built, maintaining your boundaries, and having the strength to demand respect, even from your own blood. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for a family is to refuse to be its victim. Has someone you trusted implicitly ever forced you to question everything you thought you knew about them? Share your thoughts below. And if you found some value in this story, I invite you to subscribe.